Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to look at 3 cases where people disappeared and then were just never seen again. But not only did they completely disappear, the circumstances of each of them just seem impossible. It seems like finding them should be easy, but even years later, there are even more questions than answers. So as always, viewer discretion is advised. On June 25th, 1986, at around 6 a.m., a tanker truck carrying 5,000 gallons of sulfuric acid came flying down a mountain pass near Madrid, Spain. Based on how fast it was going, other cars could tell that it wasn't just reckless driving. It seemed like the truck was unable to stop. So eventually, it had gotten up to 140 kilometers an hour or 90 miles per hour down this steep, winding road. And as it got more and more out of control, first it sideswiped another car and then ripped its mirror off, then it slammed into the back of another truck, forcing it off the road. Finally, the other truck was able to swerve off to the side of the road, and then the out-of-control truck crashed head-on into an oncoming vehicle. This caused it to flip over, and the contents of the tanker poured all over the wreckage, the surrounding area, and the cab of the truck where the driver was. Police and rescuers got to the scene quickly afterward, but it would take 3 hours of pouring sand and lime all over the wreckage to neutralize the acid enough to begin a rescue. Finally, they reached the cab of the truck and found that there were 2 people inside, and they were both deceased and partially covered in the contents of the tanker. From the documents found inside, the 2 people were identified as husband and wife, Andres and Carmen. Weirdly, in addition to finding the couple, police also found what looked like children's stuff inside the truck as well. This included some children's cassette tapes and some children's clothes. Once the bodies had been identified, police started calling the next of kin, starting with Carmen's mother, who was obviously devastated to learn about the crash. But horrifyingly, she would also ask about the boy and if he was alright, because apparently the items the police found that looked like they belonged to a child actually belonged to the couple's son, Juan Pedro, who was supposed to be with them. Juan Pedro, who was 10 at the time, would frequently join his father in some of his shorter trips, but had never joined him on a long trip like the one they were on at the time of the crash. That's because this was sort of a special trip. Andres had promised his son that if he worked hard and he studied hard and got good grades that year, he'd take him on this longer trip that was planned for some time. Juan Pedro then did as his father asked and did excellent in school, so his father agreed to bring him, and the family of 3 left the day before the crash on the evening of June 24th. Here's where things start to get weird. Despite a thorough search of the inside of the truck, the surrounding area, and even under the sand and lime that was poured all over the wreckage, there wasn't a single trace of Juan Pedro anywhere. Obviously, first people's thought was to blame the contents of the tanker and say that the remains could have been completely dissolved. This was then immediately refuted by chemists because apparently even if someone had been completely submerged for over a week, that still wouldn't be enough for 0 traces of them to be found. And we know that because of the crash, he couldn't have been completely submerged. It was more like being splashed. So the next thing the investigators examined was the truck's tachograph, which is a device which measures the distance traveled and stops made. And this revealed a few interesting things. First was that on the way up the other side of the mountain, the truck made close to a dozen short stops with some less than 20 seconds. Investigators then cross-referenced this with the traffic in the area at the time and found that there should have been no reason to make these stops. People have since speculated that maybe these stops were the beginning of Andres noticing some mechanical failure, which later caused the crash as they descended. Either way, the next interesting thing the tachograph revealed was that the family had hit the rest of their planned stops, including one at a restaurant to eat dinner. Investigators then confirmed with the restaurant staff that the family had been there, including Juan Pedro. So he was accounted for at least until the night before the accident. This means that either Juan Pedro was with them the morning of the crash, or maybe even stranger, he wasn't with them anymore that morning for some unknown reason. There are several weird and unconfirmed pieces of evidence and theories, and I'm going to go over them quickly, but from what I can tell, these are largely unsubstantiated, so take them with a grain of salt. Usually I wouldn't even address these because they're so outlandish, but since there really isn't anything else to go on, I think it made sense here. The first of these pieces of evidence is that apparently several witnesses claim to have seen a white van pull up to the crash site immediately afterward. Then, a Nordic-looking man and woman got out of the van, checked around the site, and then left. In another version of these events, the couple was dressed as a doctor and a nurse, and the man picked up some sort of package and then they left. It's hard to confirm whether or not this actually happened. The second and more interesting is some sort of involvement in drug trafficking by Andres involuntarily due to pressure from local groups. His family claims that he was receiving threatening phone calls in the lead up to the trip, so there's some speculation that maybe Juan Pedro was taken sometime during the night. This might fit with the sighting of the man and woman in the van who had some involvement. There are also several unconfirmed sightings of Juan Pedro alive after the crash, but that usually happens in cases where people disappear anyway. The final theory is that Juan really was with the couple and was possibly thrown from the vehicle in the crash or survived the initial crash but then wandered away and succumbed to his injuries, far enough that his remains weren't found. This also seems sort of unlikely given the thorough search. And that's all we really know, which is sort of hard to make sense of. If you're just as confused as I was reading through this case, you're not alone. In fact, Interpol, which is an international police organization, has said that this is the most perplexing case they've ever examined. Maurice de Metz, also known as Doc, had spent his professional life writing, preaching, and working in academia. But in the early 1980s, at 84 years old, he was enjoying all that retirement had to offer with his wife of more than 50 years. Throughout his life, Doc developed an interest in gems and minerals, and although he needed a bit of help getting around due to his age, it was still a hobby he pursued on a regular basis. On April 29, 1981, Doc's longtime friend, 51-year-old David McSherry, arrived at his house to pick him up. The two of them planned to go topaz hunting in the Pike National Forest, and they were aiming for a place called Devil's Head, which is a 9,700-foot mountain. A little while after setting off, David pulled into a small parking area at the base of Devil's Head, right next to a picnic spot. Then after he put the car in park, he got out and walked to the passenger side to help Doc get out of the car. From where the parking lot was, there was an abandoned topaz mine a few hundred feet away, and although Doc was in no condition to walk around inside the mine, there were still plenty of topaz around the outside. So from the parking area, the two men crossed the road and entered a densely forested area that gradually descended. The slope was about as steep as Doc could handle, but as long as he had David to hang on to for stability and the ground wasn't too treacherous, he was able to manage. As they approached, Doc spotted a sandy area near the mine entrance that looked perfect for him and pointed it out. David guided him over there, helped him to the ground, and then put his bag of tools next to him. Once Doc had everything he needed, David went to look for his own spot to dig and found one about 50 yards away. This put them out of view of one another through the trees, but they were still well within earshot. After setting his supplies down, David reached into his tool bag and started topaz hunting, and the two of them continued this for a couple of hours. At around 3 o'clock, David knew Doc would probably be reaching his limit and it was time to start thinking about heading home. So he walked over to where he left Doc and gave him the warning that they needed to hit the road in about 15 minutes. Doc then looked up and agreed before turning his attention back to the sand to squeeze out every second he could of the time that remained. David then turned around and made his way back to his digging area to collect his tools and the small pile of topaz he was taking with him. After all of his equipment was packed up, David turned back to retrieve Doc and his tools, but when he reached the point where he should be able to see him, Doc was gone. This was weird because he hadn't moved much the entire time they'd been there, at least not when he had walked over there just a few minutes earlier. Then when David reached Doc's sandpit, he realized that his friend wasn't just gone. It was like he was never there in the first place. There wasn't a single trace of him. The tools were gone, the holes he had dug were filled in, and despite the soft sand all around, there were no footprints in any direction. David then called out for Doc a few times, but his shouts were met with silence. After a quick look around the area, David thought that maybe Doc had walked back to the car by himself somehow. At the same time, this thought worried him because he knew the way back was all uphill at a slight angle. He knew that it was unlikely that Doc would have been able to get to the car on his own. And sure enough, when David got close enough to see the car, there was still no sign of Doc. David then unlocked the driver's side door and leaned into the car to lay on the horn, hoping it would be loud enough to get Doc's attention. After each long beep, he would stop and wait, barely moving or breathing so he could hear even the faintest response, but nothing ever came. Thoroughly alarmed by this point, David then closed the car door and walked back to the road. Then he managed to flag down the next car and told the driver what happened and that he needed a search and rescue team up there right away. Without hesitation, the driver spun the car around and flew back the way he came, and about 10 miles down the dirt road, he saw a payphone and pulled over to call 911. By 11 o'clock that night, Devil's Head was filled with activity as searchers flooded the area. The circumstances of Doc's disappearance should have made him easy to find. Doc's mobility was so limited that he couldn't have gone far. The terrain in just about every direction meant that Doc would have needed help to even walk, let alone travel an appreciable distance. Because of this, the search and rescue was hopeful that he'd be found quickly. This meant they could pour all of their resources, which included 200 searchers, a dozen dogs, and even a few helicopters, into a smaller, more thorough search area. On paper, Doc should have been found before the sun came up. But by sunup, there was still not a single trace of him. With what they had to go on, which was essentially nothing, authorities developed two main theories to work from. The first was that Doc wandered off and fell or got stuck somewhere, and the other was an animal attack. The problem with both theories was that there was no evidence to support either one. You'd think that in either scenario, given how thorough the search was, they'd find Doc's dropped tools or tattered clothing, or maybe the dogs would pick up the scent of blood if it was an animal attack. But unfortunately, the search would continue for 5 days and not a single trace was found. It was just beyond comprehension that there was still no sign of Doc anywhere. The dogs couldn't even pick up a scent anywhere in the area. It was like something came down from the sky and just quietly plucked him up from the sandpit. So, with absolutely nothing to show for 5 days around the clock searching, the effort was officially called off. Doc's family protested the decision, and his daughter was adamant in the first few days after Doc's disappearance that he was abducted, but just like the other theories, there was nothing to support this idea. Just about the only thing left before theory spiraled off into outlandishness was foul play. From the moment the call came in to when the search was called off, the only thing anyone had to go off of was David's account of what happened. So the longer things went on with no sign of Doc, the more suspicion of David and his story grew. Between the lack of evidence and the highly trained search dogs failing to find a scent anywhere was more than enough for some people to point to David as the reason for Doc's disappearance. But while David had the means and the opportunity to harm Doc, there was just no motive. By all accounts, they'd never even fought in the time they knew one another, and the pair had gone on many similar trips in the past without incident. So, David was eventually ruled out as well, which left police and searchers completely baffled. In total, an area of 5 square miles was covered multiple times during the official search. One investigator even called it the most detailed search the county had conducted in the past 15 years. Then, even once the official search was cancelled, authorities kept a close eye on anything related to Doc that might lead to new information. In the weeks after he vanished, Doc's credit cards never turned up anywhere, and daily checks with nearby hospitals produced nothing either. A $5,000 reward was even offered by Doc's family, but still no new information came in. So that's where the trail goes cold. In the more than 40 years since Doc vanished, nothing has ever been found at Devil's Head or anywhere else that could lead investigators to solve the case. In the 1990s, the governor of Colorado officially declared Doc dead, and the case was officially closed. So that begs the question, how does an 84-year-old with extremely limited mobility disappear so thoroughly in the span of just a few minutes? It just seems impossible. On the evening of April 20th, 1989, a woman named Carol was driving back from Circle, Montana, where she'd just finished a long shift as a police dispatcher and was looking forward to getting home. It was 8:15 p.m. and it was starting to get dark, and as she was driving, the car in front of her suddenly swerved onto the shoulder. Then, as soon as the car was out of her line of sight, she realized why the car had swerved, which was to avoid another car that was heading directly at her into oncoming traffic. Unfortunately, by the time she realized what was happening, she had no time to move out of the way or even hit her brakes, and so the two cars slammed into one another. Once the car stopped moving, Carol was scared and her heart was beating fast, but she didn't feel like she was injured. Her head hurt slightly, but thankfully she didn't think anything was broken. So she unbuckled her seatbelt and crawled out of her wrecked car to find out what had happened. Carol then approached the woman driving the other car to see if she could help. She was actually more concerned than angry, worried that the driver might have badly injured herself. She looked back at her car and knew it was totaled, and there was no way the other car would ever drive again. The accident was just too bad. Luckily, it looked like the other woman was unharmed. Carol then walked over to her and asked if she was okay, and the woman looked straight at Carol, but not just straight at her, more like straight through her, as if Carol wasn't even there. A few minutes earlier, the woman in the car that swerved, a woman named Peggy, had been driving down the highway with her father before the oncoming car forced her off the road. After seeing the crash, Peggy and her dad worried about the other drivers, so they got out to check on them. Weirdly though, Peggy then watched the woman in the oncoming car walk away from the crash, climb over the fence by the side of the highway, stare at the wreck for a few minutes, almost as if she was a spectator, and then walk away into the field by the road. As she was watching this happen, Peggy also noticed Carol had a nasty wound on her head, so she left her with her father while she looked for the nearest phone to call for an ambulance. Carol was in the hospital for a few days after, but she would go on to make a full recovery. In the meantime, police wanted to know who the other driver was who just walked away. Peggy and Carol both described her as about 5'6", with strawberry blonde hair and freckles, weighing about 110 pounds. When the police ran the license plate, they discovered it was owned by a woman from Bozeman, Montana named Patricia Meehan. They didn't know for sure if she was driving or if it was someone else, but they were worried whoever it was might have been hurt. The way she acted suggested that she might have a head injury of some kind, and they were worried she might die out in the fields if she didn't get help. Right away, they began to search and they brought in tracking dogs to see if they could pick up a scent in the fields in the surrounding area. And they would end up finding some footprints a little ways from the crash site that looked like they belonged to the tennis shoes of the woman seen walking away. They would then follow these for hours until they finally disappeared, and by then it was 3 a.m. and there was still no sign of her, so they called off the search until daylight. Shortly afterward, it was determined that it had to have been Patricia Meehan who had been driving the car that night. Known to her friends and family as Patty, she was raised in Pittsburgh. She eventually went to school for early childhood development, but never finished her course, deciding she liked horses more than kids. This led her to take a job in Montana as a ranch hand, which is where she was living when the crash happened. By April of 1989 though, something was wrong. All the people who knew Patty thought her behavior was getting unusual. She was usually soft-spoken, calm, and collected, but prior to the accident, she was sometimes quite down, sometimes a little disoriented, and at other times hyperactive. And it wasn't just the people around her who had noticed this difference. Patty herself seemed to have realized that something was wrong, so she made an appointment to see a psychologist on April 21st, hoping to figure out what was happening. At the same time, she started to think about going home to Pittsburgh. In fact, the day before the accident, she called her parents and asked if she could move back with them for a while. They said that was okay, especially because she'd been struggling lately, and said to call back the next day so they could sort out the details. On the morning of April 20th, Patty told her landlord she was going away for a few days, but didn't say where she was going. He knew she had an appointment with a psychologist, and she seemed to be acting strange, but he didn't think it was his place to question her any further. Afterward, Patty climbed into her car and set off, and the next time anyone would see her, she would be nearly 400 miles away, crashing into the front of Carol's car. Now, sometimes people flee a car crash because they're frightened about what might happen. The police assumed that's what might have happened, so they called around to family and friends to see if she'd been in touch. Then they became even more concerned when they found out she'd been acting strange in the lead up to the accident. They were worried that the behavior Carol and Peggy had described wasn't just post-accident disorientation, but something much more serious. One idea they initially came up with was that she was trying to end things by crashing intentionally, and that she looked shocked afterwards because it hadn't worked. The day after the crash, at sunrise, police decided to widen the search. They sent up airplanes over the next 2 days to see if they could spot anything nearby. Highway Patrol launched a ground search along with the police and ambulance crews. Workers from local ranches even joined in, but as things got colder, they started to worry that Patty might get caught in the freezing rain, so they kept the pilots up in the air and brought in dogs to search as well. Eventually, a storm rolled into the air with powerful wind and rain, and rescuers guessed that most people in that situation would find an empty building to shelter in, so the search team focused on those afterward. After the storm, planes went up again, but there was no sign of Patty on the ground anywhere, so by then, police were starting to think she wasn't in the area anymore. Instead, maybe she'd made it somewhere safe or hitched a ride somewhere. On May 25th, so over a month after the accident, Patty's parents and brother flew into the area. Then they started driving up and down the major highways, crisscrossing the state while simultaneously handing out posters at truck stops and rest areas. And incredibly, quite a few people thought they'd seen Patty. Her parents had brought as many pictures of her as possible and some family videos as well. And the hope was that showing these to people would help sort the false sightings from the genuine ones as fast as possible. Based on all that information, eventually Patty's family narrowed down dozens of sightings to a few and created a potential timeline of her movement since the crash. On May 4th, she was apparently seen drinking water for over 5 hours in a Hardee's in Minnesota. When it closed, she was seen walking out to a 24-hour diner. A police officer came across her that night and he was worried about her and asked who she was. She wouldn't tell him her name, so he asked where she'd come from and she wanted to tell him several different places. Then, supposedly, on May 5th, she was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at a truck stop, and then a little while later, she was seen by a waitress in a diner in another nearby city. The waitress claimed that Patty was with a man in his 30s, although the man has never been able to be identified. Then she was seen twice more between the 11th and the 13th of May in Billings, Montana, and then finally, apparently somebody spotted her back in Bozeman on May 19th. Again, she was seen in a restaurant, this time asking for breakfast in a rush, because according to the waitress, the woman said she had to leave at 9 a.m. If these were all sightings of Patty, it seemed like she was traveling straight back to Bozeman in almost a straight line across the I-90. Most of the people who claimed to see her also said the same thing. She was polite and soft-spoken, but her clothes were messy and she seemed exhausted. They also said that while in the restaurants, she sat with her hands tucked between her knees and paid for anything she ate with loose change. And sometimes she'd spend hours in the restaurants as if she had nowhere else to go. This led her parents to wonder if maybe she'd been hitching rides down the highway and couldn't contact anyone because she was suffering from amnesia. Then on May 30th, a truck driver claimed he offered her a lift going north into Washington, but she turned him down. The following week, she was apparently seen in Tacoma at a truck stop on the I-5. Because of this, Patty's family and the investigators wondered if she'd gone to visit an ex-boyfriend who lived in the area, but he hadn't seen her. Then they thought she might be heading to her sister's apartment in Seattle, but she didn't show up there either. So despite all of these leads, they still couldn't find her or even get any definitive proof she had been at one place or another. So eventually, her family was forced to return to Pennsylvania and left the investigators to carry on the search without them. Patty's disappearance was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in September of that year, and after the show aired, investigators were bombarded with tips, some good and some bad. Either way, the police made sure to investigate all of them, and a few of them stood out. In late September, a woman said she picked up a hitchhiker who fit Patty's description in Victor, Montana. She said the woman wanted a ride to Missoula and that they talked about her love of horses. That night, the woman and her husband let her sleep at their house because everywhere was closed and there was nowhere else for her to go. Then they dropped her at a truck stop the next morning and told them she planned to ride to Whitefish, Montana to stay with a friend. What made this tip seem real was that quite a few other people called in to say they had seen her in the same area. But unfortunately, despite the information, they still weren't any closer to finding her. What didn't help the search was that sometimes other women were mistaken for Patty. In December of that year, a man in a bar in Kalispell, Montana, was so convinced that he'd found her that he grabbed her wrists and wouldn't let her leave until police arrived. When the police got to the bar, she matched the description so perfectly that they took her in for questioning. But eventually, the woman got a hold of her ID and proved who she was, and she wasn't Patty. On another occasion, on August 30th, 1990, a homeless woman was picked up by the police who were convinced it was her. She looked the same, and even her voice was the same as the woman in the home videos they saw on TV. But when they checked her fingerprints against Patty's, they realized that the woman wasn't her either. Since her initial disappearance, there have been more than 5,000 supposed sightings of her. Quite a few have turned out to be mistaken identities, and others don't lead anywhere at all. And tragically, her parents kept looking for her for the rest of their lives but would pass away before ever finding her. As with most cases, people have come up with a few theories to explain what happened, and there are a few theories that fit with the events. One is the theory that her family still believes, which is that the accident gave her amnesia. Then she might have headed back toward her apartment using instinct, and she may still be wandering around in the United States trying to figure out who she is. It's also possible that all those sightings were just wishful thinking, and after walking for hours into the fields after the crash, she died from her injuries and exposure. The search for her was extensive, but Montana is a big place, and her body could still be out there somewhere. And obviously, another big mystery is what caused the crash in the first place. Was Patty suffering a psychotic break, or because she knew something was off, was something physical affecting her behavior like a brain tumor? Unfortunately, unless Patty is found one day, we'll probably never know. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the email found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.